Officer Robert Barker was suspended for 120 days for failing to report the allegation for affiliation with the Proud Boys, a far-right extremist group at the center of the criminal inquiry into the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. There was content leaked from his phone where he made comments about different communities, and we'd like for you all to take further investigation into it. Despite all this evidence against him, CPD leadership claimed that it was less than 50% likely that Barker was affiliated with the Proud Boys. And so one of the things we want to make sure is that as a commission that stands for the community against things like this, what is your all stance? How are you taking this into consideration as you're working on policy and further uplifting the community and those who are affected by incidents like this, as well as one of the things that I realized in the last space that we had and this one as well, was that there are not many young people that are in the space. And so as an advocate for young people, what I would like to see moving forward is how are we making sure that we're prioritizing young people in these spaces, the voices of the young people, especially in the Inglewood community. I think is one that's disconnected as it pertains to young people and police relations, but also disconnected with the work of what you all are actually doing. And so how are we working together to making sure that's actually upheld into what we talked about in the actual ordinance. It was empowering to know that there have been steps moving forward regarding the immigration status has been taken into account with the group being created, but I also like to see some movement. If there has been already, please let me know as it pertains to young people also working with the commission.
Thank you so much, Khalil Pittman. So before I call up our next speaker, I do want to make sure that you are able to submit public comments via email by emailing CommunityCommissionPublicComment@cityofchicago.org. Again, that is CommunityCommissionPublicComment@cityofchicago.org. If there are any written public comments that anyone would like to bring forth, please bring it right up over here to us. And so the next speaker that we have is Kobe Guillory. I know Kobe. Okay. So I do not see Kobe Guillory. So do we have any other public comments before we close this section of our meeting? So seeing no other speakers, I'm going to turn this back over to Commissioner Driver.
Thank you, Commissioner Terry. The next order of business is new business, and we'll begin with the confirmation of committee members. At our first public meeting, the commission voted to create 10 committees. The ordinance that created the commission gives the commission many duties. Committees are the primary way that we can make sure that the commission carries out all of its duties. Each committee is responsible for an important piece of the commission's work. Each committee will be made up of 2 commissioners. Each commissioner will serve on 2 or 3 committees. The committee will be the primary way that the commission carries out its business in between public meetings. After we created committees at our first meeting, we talked about which commissioners are most interested in each committee, and we also talked about what the commission needs to get its work done. Based on those conversations, Vice President Gomez and I assigned commissioners to different committees. We'll now vote to confirm the committee assignments. Is there a motion to confirm the committee assignments? The chair recognizes Commissioner Terry.
I move to confirm these committee assignments. For the Executive Committee, President Anthony Driver and Vice President Oswaldo Gomez. For the Community Engagement Committee, Commissioners Cliff Nellis and Commissioner Ramel Terry. For the Community Policing Committee, Commissioners Cliff Nellis and Isaac Troncoso. For the COPA Committee, Commissioners Beth Brown and Yvette Loizon. For the Chicago Police Department Budget and Resource Allocation Committee, Commissioners Anthony Driver and Oswaldo Gomez. For the Chicago Police Department Goal Setting and Performance Assessment Committee, Commissioners Beth Brown and Cliff Nellis. For the Noncitizens Advisory Council Committee, Commissioner Beth Brown and Oswaldo Gomez. For the Police Board Committee, Commissioners Isaac Troncoso and Yvette Loizen. For the Policy Review and Development and Consent Decree Compliance Committee, yes, these are a mouthful, Commissioners Ramel Terry and Yvette Loizen. And for the Ad Hoc Police Superintendent Search Committee, Commissioners Anthony Driver and Ramel Terry.
Second the motion.
Commissioner Terry moved that the commission confirm the assignment to commission committees, and Commissioner Nellis second. Is there a debate on the motion? Hearing none, we'll now move to a vote. Those in favor of adopting the motion to confirm the committee assignments, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, please say nay. The ayes have it and the motion carries. The committee assignments are confirmed. The next order of business is committee reports. First, we'll hear from the Police Board Committee. Commissioner Troncoso.
Thank you. I'm Commissioner Isaac Troncoso, and with Commissioner Yvette Loizen, I'm on the Police Board Committee. The Police Board plays a huge role in the police accountability system. When the police superintendent files charges to fire a police officer, the Police Board decides whether that police officer should be fired. And when there's an allegation that a police officer engaged in serious misconduct and COPA investigates and makes a recommendation about how the officer should be disciplined, and the police superintendent does not agree with COPA, then the Police Board decides how that officer should be disciplined. Ever since the Police Board was created, members have been chosen by the mayor. But the law that created the Community Commission gave the commission a responsibility for nominating candidates to serve on the Police Board. The mayor has the final say on who's on the Police Board, but the mayor can only choose from a list created by the commission. There are now 3 vacancies on the Police Board, and the commission has come up with a new open way to fill them that is aligned with the commission's mission. We want to ensure that Chicagoans from all communities have a voice that impacts public safety and accountability. We're committed to ensuring that police board members are representative of our entire city. So the commission developed an open selection process for police board members. Additionally, the commission has emailed and called over 150 Chicago neighborhood associations and block clubs to effect that outreach. And if you are part of one of those such organizations and would like to be contacted in the future, please find me after the meeting is over. Anyone who's interested in serving on the police board can fill out an application that's on the commission's website, chicago.gov/Chicago Community Commission. The application is available in English and in Spanish. Commissioners will carefully review every application that's submitted, interview some of the applicants, and learn what we can about each applicant before taking a vote to select nominees to send to the mayor. If you're interested, we hope you'll apply, and we hope you'll all spread the word and encourage others to apply as well. This is a whole new way of choosing police board members, and we want to do the best we can to get the word out so that we have a large pool of very strong applicants. So we're now extending the deadline to submit the application to November 20th. Police board applications are now due November 20th, and you can learn more about the police board's work and find the application again on the commission's website, chicago.gov/Chicago Community Commission. In addition to developing the open application process to serve on the police board, we've spent time building knowledge about the police board as well. That knowledge will help us to identify and nominate the strongest possible candidates for the police board. It will also help as we carry out another annual duty where we identify some priorities that the police board should take on during the next year. And then at the end of the year, we have an obligation to do an assessment of how well the police board did in advancing those goals and in its other work. So we've met with the police board president and its executive director, and we'll continue to talk to experts and gather information that will help us to do our job overseeing the police board. We also want to mention that an issue that has been in the news lately. When the police board is reviewing a case where COPA and the police superintendent disagree about how an officer should be disciplined, city law says that one police board member can review the situation and make a decision. These are sometimes very difficult decisions. For some time, a number of people have raised questions about whether it's a good idea to have these cases decided by just one person at a time. And last week, both the chief administrator of COPA and the president of the police board raised concerns about these one-person decisions. These are serious questions about whether this process is fair for people who have brought complaints against police officers, whether it's fair for police officers who are facing serious discipline, and whether it's fair for members of the police board who have to carry a heavy burden all on their own. Based on these concerns that are shared by a pretty broad and diverse set of people, we are exploring whether our committee should look at this issue more closely and consider making recommendations to the City Council about changing the law. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Troncoso. Next, we'll have a report from the Non-Citizen Advisory Council Committee, Commissioner Gomez.
I'm a little shorter than Isaac. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, President Driver. My name is Oswaldo Gomez, and together with Commissioner Beth Brown, I am a member of the Non-Citizen Advisory Council Committee. The ordinance that created the Community Commission says that the Commission must create a Non-Citizen Advisory Council. That's because the community members who drafted the ordinance understood that the police sometimes don't treat immigrants and non-citizen Chicagoans the same way as everyone else, or the way that they should be treated. The Non-Citizen Advisory Council is a way to ensure that those perspectives and experiences are reflected and incorporated in the Commission's work. We want to make sure that everyone who is interested in serving on the Advisory Council has an opportunity to participate. We, like the Police Board, also have an open application process. There's an application on the Commission's website that is currently in English and in Spanish. If you're interested, please apply. And please spread the word about this. Applications, like the Police Board applications, are also due on November 20th. We are also making a commitment to extend the application and translate it to any language necessary. So if you know anyone that has difficulty filling out an application in English or Spanish, please let the Commission know, and we will make an effort to make that available to them.
Thank you, Commissioner Gomez. Next, we have a report from the COPA Committee, Commissioner Brown.
Thank you, Commissioner Driver, and happy birthday, Commissioner Gomez. Happy birthday. I couldn't resist. I'm Beth Brown, and together with Commissioner Yvette Loizon, I'm on the COPA Committee. COPA stands for the Civilian Office of Police Accountability. COPA is another huge part of the police accountability system. COPA is responsible for investigating cases that involve allegations of police misconduct and making recommendations about discipline for the officers they are investigating. There are also some situations where COPA does an investigation even if no one makes a complaint about something. For example, every time a police officer fires a gun, COPA investigates. Every time someone is seriously injured or dies in police custody, COPA investigates. Our commission has an oversight role with COPA that is similar to the role the commission has with the police board. The commission can hire and fire the chief administrator of COPA. The commission also has to work every year to identify priorities that COPA should take on for the next year. And then at the end of the year, the commission has to do an assessment of how well COPA did in advancing those goals and in its other work. To help us carry out those responsibilities, we've met with the chief administrator and some of her senior leadership team. We're planning an in-depth briefing where we'll learn a lot more about how COPA operates. And we'll be consulting with experts and getting your input as well. One of the gaps we've identified is that because COPA doesn't have public meetings, there's not a forum where they can talk about their work. As part of the process to understand the work of COPA today, after 5 years of being in existence, we'll hear later tonight from the chief administrator and have an opportunity to ask her questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Brown. Next, we have a report from the Chicago Police Department Goal Setting and Performance Assessment Committee. Commissioner Nellis.
Good evening, everybody. You can say good evening back. Thank you for all being here tonight, sincerely. This is important work, and community is the most important part of our work. So thank you for being here. So my name is Cliff Nellis, and together with Commissioner Beth Brown, who you just heard from, we are on the CPD Goal Setting and Performance Assessment Committee. You heard from Commissioner Troncoso and Commissioner Brown, who spoke about the role that the Police Board Committee and the COPA Committee will play in setting annual goals and progress on those goals for those respective entities and how well they are doing in achieving those goals. We will be doing the same thing for the Chicago Police Department. And we think this is an incredibly important function that hasn't received a lot of attention. And so I want to talk a bit more about it with you tonight. A critical part of our commission's oversight obligations is establishing strategic goals and expectations for the three entities that it oversees. That's the Chicago Police Department, COPA, and the Police Board. And then taking a look at how much progress they're making in their goals within these three agencies. The process is laid out in the ordinance, and it says how the goal setting and assessment will work. I'll describe for how it will work for the police department, but it will be the same as it will be done for the COPA and the police board. Starting in December, we're going to work to set goals and expectations with CPD and the superintendent for the following year of 2023. We will speak with a lot of different constituents and people when setting these goals, including the consent decree monitor, public safety, arms of government, and community-based organizations, residents. There will be opportunities for anyone who wants to provide input into their goals to provide that input. We will be reaching out to residents, police officers, local and national experts. We're sharing this information with you tonight so that you can begin thinking about priorities for next year that you would like to see and share them with us. The process will start off, as I said, in the beginning of December, when the commission will engage with the Chicago Police Department to set the goals and expectations for the following year. It's supposed to be a collaborative process between the commission and the superintendent, but the commission does have the final say on what the goals and expectations will be that we set. By the end of January, the commission will develop its final goals and expectations of the superintendent, and we will share that publicly. We'll share that with the superintendent, of course, and then make that public. The commission's proposal will be informed by all the input that we receive from all the entities that previously described beforehand. So we really encourage everyone here, and for those of you who have networks beyond that are present tonight, please spread the word, because we really want to hear their input when we set these goals. We have a lot of tools that it can be used throughout the year to hold the superintendent accountable to the goals that we set. One of them is at the end of every year, the commission will do a formal assessment of the work that the superintendent did or did not meet the goals and expectations that we set at the beginning of the year. Again, we encourage you to start thinking now about the goals and expectations that we would like to see for the police department next year. Please put them in writing and share them with the commission. Is there a specific address, email address, that people should send those things to in writing? We'll get you that in a second. Remember that this process isn't just about setting goals and expectations, it's also about assessing progress. So it's going to be really important to set goals that are tied to performance measures, something that is measurable. That way we can be clear about what we're focusing on and what success looks like. If you're thinking about goals and expectations that you'd want to recommend, try to be specific about what progress would look like and how you'd measure success. If you're familiar with SMART goals, I would recommend SMART goals. All of this, the goal setting and the annual review, provides a big opportunity for greater public input into the operation of the police department. We hope, thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Brown. So the email that you should send your recommendations to is CommunityCommissionPublicComment@cityofchicago.org. That's CommunityCommissionPublicComment, all one word, @cityofchicago.org. So we want to make sure that they're SMART goals, so please be thinking about that. All of this, the goal setting and the annual review, provides a big opportunity for greater public input into the operation of the police department. We hope it will increase transparency and accountability and lead to better working relationships between police and community. And most of all, we hope it will lead to better outcomes, creating a safer, stronger, and healthier city. This entire process will benefit from as much input as possible, so please, as I've said, I think 3 times already, please start now to put your thoughts and ideas together. We'll be starting to collect them in December. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Nellis. Next, Commissioner Gomez and I will report on the work of the CPD Budget and Resource Allocation Committee. Commissioner Gomez.
Thank you, President Driver. As many of you know, the ordinance that created the Community Commission says that every year, the Commission must review the police department budget. And before the City Council votes on an appropriations ordinance, the Commission can comment on its recommendations and the changes that it would like to see. A little more than 3 weeks ago, on October 3rd, the mayor introduced the city's budget, which included the individual budgets for every department, including the police department. That was the first time that we were able to see the budget. The City Council is planning to vote on the budget on November 7th. So we will have just over a month to review it and comment on it and make recommendations accordingly. As you all know, the budget is really dense. It's more than $1.9 billion in total, and it includes hundreds of different items across many different agencies. We've done a lot of work to understand what's in that budget. Every commissioner here has done an amazing job of reading it carefully. We got a briefing from the city's budget department. We watched budget hearings for the police department and other public safety departments. We talked to the policing expert. We spoke to people inside of the police department, some of them who reached out to us to share their ideas and some of their concerns. We had a special meeting on Monday where Superintendent Brown and many members of the command staff actually came in and answered questions in a public meeting. And we spoke to a lot of people in Chicago and around the country to try to understand what the budget means for the city. Now, we've gotten feedback from some of you tonight, and we hope that you'll continue to share that feedback. After all, it's very important that we hear your thoughts about the budget as we work to develop comments and recommendations. You don't have to just share recommendations here. You can also share your ideas in writing to us by sending an email to the commission at CommunityCommissionPublicComment@cityofchicago.org. Now, we're working to learn as much as we can, as quickly as we can, so that we can offer comments that are rooted in a lot of research and that incorporate ideas from a lot of different people. We're going to share comments and recommendations with the City Council before they vote on the budget on November 7th. But we know our work will not end there. At our public meeting on Monday, the superintendent committed to providing us with a lot of data that will help us better understand how well the police department is using the budget that it's proposing. We'll be making additional requests for information and data soon. The truth is that it will take a lot of time for CPD to get us the data and the information, and it will take also a lot of time for us to analyze and understand it. Now, it's absolutely essential that we be thorough and fair in this process, and we know that all of that, as I said, will take a lot of time. Now, because we are asking hard questions that demand complicated answers, we also want to point to some important things. The law that created the Community Commission lays out a very broad set of goals for the Commission. Many of those goals are tied to the budget, and advancing the goals is a long-term project. Some of the goals that we are driven by include increasing public safety, building trust between communities and the department, increasing the efficiency in the use of public safety resources, and ensuring that the police department resources are in use and efficiently to address public health or safety issues that other professionals are better equipped to address. We also are tasked to encourage preventative, proactive, and community-based approaches to public safety. Now, the annual budget review that we're required to conduct is a good way to get this process started, but with those broad goals, we know that this is only the beginning. We're definitely committed to asking hard questions, grappling with complicated answers, and doing it transparently and collaboratively. We think that these incredibly challenging issues, we think deeply about these incredibly challenging issues because that's the best and only way forward. Thank you for your time. I hope you stay tuned to hear more about what we're doing in this process. Commissioner Driver.
Thank you, Commissioner Gomez. I'd like to wrap up our committee report with a few thoughts on where we are now. At Monday's meeting with Superintendent Brown and his top leaders, we asked a lot of hard questions. The questions were based on serious concerns about some very significant challenges that the Chicago Police Department is facing now. We appreciate that the superintendent came out and answered our questions in public and agreed to provide us with very important data. We're going to need to work together, and Monday was a good step in that direction. But so far, we've learned very little that addresses the concerns that were raised. As Commissioner Gomez said, we need to be fair and thorough. We need to look carefully at data that we don't have yet. We can't reach any conclusions until we have that. What we do know is that Chicago's homicide and shooting rates are extraordinarily high, higher than they've been for most of the last 25 years, and much higher than cities like New York and Los Angeles. We are deeply concerned that the communities that are suffering the most are still subject to slow response times and inadequate staffing at the times crime and violence occur the most. And we're concerned that communities are routinely being policed by officers who don't know the community, which is bad for residents and bad for officers. Absent the data, we are worried that some communities are being over-policed and underserved. We need to know that there's a data-driven strategy to reduce violence and not just ad hoc reactionary responses based on changes in daily crime trends. Here are some of the big questions and concerns that we still have. Has the department committed enough staff resources so that it can meet its goal of rolling out its new community policing program citywide? Are enough patrol officers working in the same areas and at the same time so that they're able to build the knowledge and relationship that evidence shows leads to more effective outcomes? Are enough patrol officers able to work with the same supervisor long enough to develop relationships that set patrol officers up to be effective? Are there significant disparities in response times between predominantly Black neighborhoods and other neighborhoods, which put residents of those communities at much greater risk of being injured or killed? Is the allocation of patrol officers correlated with the days and times and places where there is the most violence? Or are we allocating patrol officers in a way that put residents in those neighborhoods at much greater risk of being harmed? Are officers working in centralized units that aren't tied to a specific community as effective to public safety as officers who work more consistently in more familiar neighborhoods? Does the police department have the infrastructure it needs to make data-driven decisions about when and where to allocate resources in order to reduce violence and killings? Does the department have resources and systems in place to assess the effectiveness of its training efforts? Is the department doing enough to address the causes of officer attrition, which has significantly depleted the workforce? Has the department created and does it effectively utilize systems to identify and address the drivers of police misconduct settlements, which consistently cost the city more than $80 million per year? When police department leaders tell us that the other large cities have much lower homicide rates than Chicago, in part because those cities invest more in non-policing strategies that have been proving to reduce violence, what is the plan to increase such investments in Chicago? Answering these and similar questions is going to be critical to the commission's work over the next year and well beyond. I will now move to the next order of business, which is reports and updates. Tonight, we've invited COPA Chief Administrator, Andrea Kersten, to provide some information about COPA's work and to take questions from commissioners. Thank you for joining us, Chief Kersten.
Thank you and good evening. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you tonight. My name is Andrea Kersten. I am the Chief Administrator of the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, also known as COPA. And I think a lot of people have ideas about what COPA is and isn't. So I planned on using my time a little bit this evening just to give sort of a general overview of all that we do as an agency, so that the public can, so this conversation can start on more of a level playing field and a better understanding of all the responsibilities that we're tasked with at our agency. And I'm going to start that conversation tonight by reading our agency's vision statement and kind of using that to sort of ground the direction of this conversation. So our vision is to be the leader in police accountability by conducting thorough investigations to advance the culture of policing and build trust in civilian oversight. COPA itself is a city agency, so we are all City of Chicago employees. Our agency is approximately 150 employees. And for those of you who have been engaged in the work of what police reform looks like in our city for many years, you're not unfamiliar with the fact that there has been some form of civilian oversight here in Chicago since the mid-70s. COPA is the third investigative agency led by civilians tasked with investigating allegations of police misconduct. COPA we just celebrated our 5-year anniversary, and we came into existence sort of on the heels of what was tremendous public outcry after the murder of Laquan McDonald and the lack of transparency around the police shooting that led to his death. So when COPA was brought into existence in 2017, it was with a very specific mandate. And that mandate was increased jurisdiction. We took on the role of investigating not just excessive force and officer-involved shootings, but also Fourth Amendment allegations against police. Previously, those had been investigated by the department's Bureau of Internal Affairs. But so now under COPA, any improper search or seizure allegation is also part of what we look at, as well as I mentioned excessive force, officer-involved shootings, deaths in custody, verbal abuse that's bias-based, so any verbal abuse against someone's race, gender, ethnicity, anything of that nature we also investigate, as well as allegations of coercion, denial of right to counsel, and then also allegations of officer-perpetrated domestic violence and now sexual misconduct. So we have a very broad and deep jurisdictional mandate, but in addition to those cases that we are tasked with looking at, we are also under a mandate to deliver transparency to issues of police misconduct and policing in general to our city. And the number one way in which we deliver that transparency is through implementing the City of Chicago's video release policy. I mentioned obviously in the wake of Laquan McDonald's murder and the lack of transparency around those videos under different city leadership back then, the idea to have an agency that was responsible for putting all of that material, those reports, the videos, the radio transmissions, all of the documentation around incidents like that out for the public so that everyone has the same information. That policy was put in place back in 2016 and still exists today. COPA is the agency that's tasked with fulfilling that policy. So we have to put up on our website and publish all of those materials to fulfill the city's policy. In addition, we also have greater transparency than our predecessor agencies around the publication of our summary reports. So when we conclude one of our investigations, we're obligated to make that information public as well, and all of that is available on our website. Issues of transparency are incredibly important when you talk about policing, or really any attempt to build trust in government. Without transparency, we don't have access to the same information, and there is no opportunity with which to build the kind of trust that's necessary to have difficult conversations around these issues. So COPA takes its transparency obligations incredibly seriously. In fact, we have an entire unit in our office that's devoted specifically to that work. What else is really important to understand about COPA is that we're staffed by civilians. So there are no sworn law enforcement personnel presently employed in our agency. That's not to say that none of us have ever had any law enforcement backgrounds. Some of our folks have, but a lot of our investigative staff, our legal staff, our communication staff, they come to this work with a whole host of backgrounds. Many of us are attorneys. I myself was a former Cook County State's attorney. we have defense attorneys, we have civil litigators, we have people with other investigative skill sets, Inspector General's office and other administrative investigative agencies that have all come to this work, social workers, some activists, people who have realized the significance of playing a role as a civilian in issues around policing, have kind of come together to coalesce in this agency in an attempt to bring a civilian perspective. And I emphasize that word civilian because it could not be of more importance. Sometimes when our recommendations don't sit well with the Chicago Police Department or other aspects of law enforcement communities, I'm often sort of challenged by like, well, how is it that you can do this job? How can you weigh in on issues of policing, having never been a police officer yourself? And my answer to that is very simple. I don't do this job because I've worn the badge, but in fact, because I haven't. This isn't a defect, but it's by design. We are asked as a civilian-led organization to come at this work from a civilian perspective. And it's our job to make sure that that perspective is informed. That's why we have a robust training academy. It's a 6-week program that engages experts both internally and externally, spends time at the Chicago Police Department to make sure it's our business to understand the training that Chicago police officers undergo, the directives and the rules that govern the way that they do their work, and to hold them to those standards, not standards set by social media or by public discourse or politicians, but standards that are set by the department itself. That's what our job is in these investigations, and that's what we endeavor to do every day. A little bit more about how we function. So I said we're an agency of 150 individuals, give or take. The biggest chunk of that is about 90 people that work specifically in investigations. So we're tasked with, like I said, investigating all these different kinds of cases, but also intaking every single complaint that comes in from a member of the public about the Chicago Police Department comes through COPA. So we have to take that, triage it, and decide whether it fits our jurisdiction, those items that I listed off, Fourth Amendment, excessive force, anything of that nature, or if it has to be investigated by the Bureau of Internal Affairs that has its own jurisdiction, or some other outside entity such as the Inspector General's office. So that's the role of our intake unit. And then we obviously have our investigative teams that we do field work, we interview officers, members of the public, we respond in real time when there are police shootings or deaths, things of that nature. So that work is ongoing, kind of around the clock, 24/7, every day of the year. We also have a quality management division that helps review the work of our investigative unit for accuracy and consistency. We have a really robust legal team that makes sure that we're complying with all the rules that govern this work, make sure that we're meeting our benchmarks with respect to the consent decree. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, under my leadership in this last year, since becoming chief administrator, I reorganized our senior leadership team to establish that our first deputy, instead of having an investigations focus, would instead have a communications and community engagement focus. So elevating the communications and the community outreach about the work that we do and making it almost like a co-equal branch of government within our agency was intentional. That's because no single outcome of any one of these investigations is ever going to matter if the community that we serve isn't understanding the work that we're doing, the context in which it occurs, and what the big picture looks like. So we have redoubled our efforts with respect to community engagement for precisely that reason. And even in the last, just this year, we've had community engagement events that touch nearly 7,000 different members of the city, and that work is only going to grow. So we're very excited about that platform and the opportunity to make sure there are more civilian voices being included in this conversation. And then lastly, I'll just talk a little bit about our agency focus for 2023. Something that I'm particularly excited about. I know you had the report from the committee on the budget for CPD. COPA also has to go before City Council in order to have our budget approved. And our significant budget allocation with respect for staffing this year was focused on our Policy Research and Analysis Division, PRAD for short. Kind of an unfortunate acronym, but that's what we go with. So that work is really aimed at making recommendations to the Chicago Police Department in order, based on what we see, what evidence comes out of our investigations, what we see as ways to improve and reform and hopefully prevent the kinds of complaints that we end up receiving at our agency. So having dedicated staff in order to further engage in that work is going to be tremendously important Over the last 5 years, we've done this work in the form of making recommendations on search warrant policy revisions, foot pursuit policy revisions. Every year, CPD asks us to weigh in on their training plan, and we leverage our investigative data and information to make those recommendations. But having data scientists, having a criminologist to lead that division, and having kind of gearing up our ability to take what the 5 years of citizen complaints that we look at in our agency, what they say, where they occur, what they mean, and figure out how to use that to create evidence-based recommendations, not even just for CPD, but also for us internally, is a real focus to make sure that we are improving our efficiency, our consistency, and our overall operations. And as I talk about consistency and efficiency and operations, that's another real focus for us as an agency this year. I'm incredibly proud of the last 5 years of COPA really crafting its investigative process and methodology. It is now time to start fully addressing our ability to do that more quickly. The timeline that we deliver our investigations on simply has to be decreased. And so we've created a unit within our investigative division that's going to be looking specifically at ways in which we can identify bottle jams within our process, and also create other opportunities to be able to close cases faster, but of course without sacrificing that methodology and that investigative integrity that we've worked really hard to establish. I think it's important to remember that when COPA came into existence, we inherited our own legacy in need of reform, right? The agencies that existed here in Chicago before that were doing this work did not live up to the expectations of the city that they serve. And so for us as an agency in this last 5 years, we first had to establish we know how to do this job. And that's what we spent the majority of these years doing, is again, building on that solid foundation of investigative process. Now, in this next iteration of what COPA is to become, it's going to be about looking at that data, being able to replicate our investigations faster and make better evidence-based recommendations externally. And we're excited about that work. And then lastly, I intend as Chief Administrator at COPA this year to really focus on agency wellness. This is something that is certainly no secret with respect to officer wellness. Obviously, the stress and the trauma of that work is real. The weight of the work on our law enforcement personnel is obvious and meaningful and has to be addressed. And as people who work adjacent to that field, we have our own version of that. And wanting to really make sure that my agency, the men and women that staff it, are equipped and prepared to deal with the difficulty of looking at these cases, reviewing this work, and doing so in the midst of what can at times feel like a really stressful firestorm. Wanting to make sure that my staff is prepared and equipped to do that is also going to be a focus for us in 2023. And lastly, I'll just say that I've said it to several of you. I've had the privilege of having some conversations with these commissioners, and I know there will be more of that to come. But I often say that I really look at this body, this commission, as a fulfilled promise by City Council. This is something that our community has called for. It is now here. It is in action. And I look forward to being in partnership as you guys guide and lead our goal setting and make sure that you hold us accountable. We can't be an agency that only seeks to hold others accountable. We have to start with ourselves. I recognize that as this agency's leader, and I look forward to that work with this commission. And any questions that you have.
Thank you, Chief Kersten. I would just say, if I can plug really quickly, their dashboard. I didn't know about it. So I actually came into this work asking a bunch of questions and wanting a bunch of data and not realizing that all the data that I was looking for is actually on a really user-friendly dashboard on the COPA website. It was also really sobering how I found out that 72% of arrests in the city of Chicago are of Black people. But nevertheless, I would encourage you all to definitely check out that site. It seems to be updated in real time. Every time I've gone to look at it, it's updated, and it's really helpful. You can break out the data in a lot of different ways so that you can better understand, have a full picture of what's happening in our city. Also want to thank Chief Administrator Kersten for joining us. We appreciate you taking the time and giving us this presentation. We will start with questions. I have only a few, and then I will pass it to other commissioners. The first is, I read a WGN, I believe, article today or yesterday that said that it quoted Superintendent Brown where he said that you all agree more than you disagree on cases. But then it also said something like there's been 44 cases, and I think 18 of them you agree. So I guess I couldn't quite get it from that article, understanding how often does the department and COPA disagree on cases, or do you have those numbers?
I do have those numbers with me tonight. You're calling me to this meeting at a very opportune moment because I've just prepared for budget. So I happen to have more of this information in my brain than I would normally. I do think the superintendent's remarks are quite fair. So we close hundreds of cases every year, and a very small fraction of those result in what's called a non-concurrence. That's the terminology used when, and let me back up to say, COPA is, we are empowered to conduct the investigation, make conclusions on that investigation, and then make recommendations to the department. The department and the officers that are the subject of our investigations are not obligated to wholesale adopt our recommendations, but there is a process by which they're able to review them and respond. That's called a non-concurrence, which means they don't agree necessarily. So out of this year, we've closed, as I said, hundreds of cases. And I think there's been 20 non-concurrences to date, and that number might be slightly off because this was at the end of the third quarter, which ended a few weeks ago. But something like 20 non-concurrences, meaning out of all of the cases closed by this agency this year, it was only 20 times that the superintendent wrote a letter to COPA saying, hey, we've got an issue with this finding. Why I think it's really important to make that clear is that what you hear about in the media are, of course, the cases where we don't have agreement. Of course, it's those times where CPD and COPA are on opposite sides of an issue that has the better story to tell, unfortunately. And so those cases rise to the surface, whereas the day in and day out work that we're doing, both of our agencies, aren't as contextualized in the media. And even within those 20 cases that they sent over non-concurrence letters, I believe, and now I'm going off memory, it's here in my book, but I'm just gonna go ahead and talk. I think 5 out of those times we were able to work out an agreement. And so about 15 of those were sent to the police board for resolution of that disagreement. And as I said, you hear about the things that we disagree on. You don't hear about the things that we agree on.
Got you. So just to be clear, the vast majority are agreed.
Correct.
Then the 20 that there is a disagreement, 15 agree, 15 disagree.
5 of them we were able to work out an agreement, and that usually, let me also back up, a lot of times when CPD and COPA disagree, it doesn't necessarily mean that CPD is saying, hey, COPA, you got the whole thing wrong, throw it out. It's usually, we agree on this point, but maybe not this point. Did you consider this? Or we agree, but we think the penalty should be less, or often they respond the penalty should be more. So there's any manner of disagreement that can happen in the non-concurrence process. And out of the 20, I believe, that we got in the first 3 quarters of this year, 5 of them we were able to work out an agreement by negotiating and better understanding one another's position. And 15 of them got sent to the Chicago Police Board for their review. And then that one member that gets selected has to make the decision as to whether the superintendent's recommendation or COPA's should prevail.
Thank you. I have a few more questions, but I think it appropriate to pass it to another commissioner now. And we'll start with Commissioner Brown.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Chief Kersten. It's good to have you here tonight. I wanted to ask you to share with everyone a little bit about why there are more than 1,700 open cases, and how do you end up with that many cases?
Sure. It's a complicated answer, I would say. There's a couple, first of all, civilian oversight and kind of COPA doing what we do as serving in this investigative capacity is not unique to Chicago. There's a version of COPA in some form or fashion in virtually every other major city, and more are emerging every year. With saying that, there's not any other investigative agency in the country that I'm aware of that has the amount of jurisdiction that we have, meaning that covering everything from sex assault to Fourth Amendment to verbal abuse to all officer-involved shootings. So we have a significantly high mandate jurisdictionally of cases that we have to take in. Something else that I think it was worth pointing to is the fact that there have been other agencies, much like COPA, that kind of came after a prior predecessor agency in a different city was shut down for one reason or another, trust was broken, et cetera. In the versions of that have been most successful, those agencies did not inherit the caseload of the predecessor agency. We did at COPA. So we started off as a new agency seeking to build and reshape. And we talk in our vision about wanting to change CPD culture. That started with COPA culture for us too. And we had a lot of work that is still ongoing to achieve that goal. But we started it with 1,000 cases from the Independent Police Review Authority. We've managed to get rid of those cases by applying that same methodology that I talked about and working our way methodically through that backlog. But that is a reality of the space that we operate within. Where I would say that the story has somewhat of a good news component to it is that if you look, and you can use our dashboards to do this, if you look over time at sort of how our complaint numbers were growing every single year, they've actually plateaued at this point. And so while I think to the public it can often be frustrating, we want to see change. We want it to be tangible. We want it to be immediate. What I see is there was a slow, well, actually rather quick rise upward in case volume, which is now maintained. And the fact that our caseload is no longer growing, but is starting to be slowly chipped away at is the sign that we are starting to sort of bend the curve back in the direction that we want in order to be able to deliver these answers on a timeline that is palatable, not just to the community, but to the officers as well as the impacted people involved in every one of these cases. It's simply not fair to the parties on either side for our investigations to take longer than necessary. So we work diligently to do that, and that's why creating a unit inside investigations that can deal directly with our operational efficiencies and not carry a huge caseload at the same time is going to be a really key component for us being able to do that. I'd also say that for me, I'm the first chief administrator of the agency. First of all, I'm the fourth chief administrator of the agency in 5 years, but the only one that's come up through the ranks, so to speak, at COPA. So I come into this job with a lot of institutional knowledge, a lot of understanding about the talent we have internally and what we need to acquire externally in order to better maximize the resources that we have. So I am optimistic, and I hope that at the end of this next year, at the end of 2023, I have different numbers to report out to you on. But I make no mistake, I understand completely that the work of reducing our caseload is of paramount importance to our community, which includes the officers involved in these cases.
Thank you. And I just have one more question for you, and that is, I was also very excited to find the website and was extremely curious to read what recommendations you had made to the Chicago Police Department about changes in policies. And so I read through every single one that you've sent. And I'm curious how often it happens that you see those changes that you're recommending to the police department actually implemented.
I think the police department has done a nice job, particularly with our training recommendations, really trying to embody those to the extent they can, because they obviously have to function within the framework of what the consent decree asks of them as far as training development and policy development. So I've been particularly appreciative of our ability to have that conversation with CPD and felt that there were a lot of positive feedback that was taken by the department in that space. I would say that I think us weighing in on the search warrant revisions that were happening in the wake of Anjanette Young's case, I do think that a lot of the things that we pointed out, I'm sure were echoed in other spaces. So I don't believe that it was only COPA's voice that was echoing some of those pieces, but I definitely saw some of the changes reflecting some of those recommendations. And then again, even when the department hasn't been able to wholesale adopt anything that we've said, I have very much appreciated their willingness to have the conversation with us. So while I think we can continue to work, and I am excited to be able to use data behind these recommendations, I think that I've been extremely appreciative of the partnership that they've been willing to extend. It's not an easy thing, and I would imagine the commission will understand this as well. For law enforcement, sometimes to let in the civilian perspective, that doesn't always seem to come naturally. But I have always felt that they are willing to at least have a conversation with us, even if we don't agree, and I appreciate that.
Great.
Thank you, Chief Kersten. I echo what everyone else has said. Thanks so much for coming here and presenting. So I have a couple questions. My first one is kind of referencing what Commissioner Brown was talking about. You mentioned that COPA plays a very significant role in helping CPD with their training, and that you leverage complaint data to better improve their training. do you have any concrete examples of when you used complaint data to change CPD's training and then that resulted in a decline of those types of complaints?
I don't think we have any correlation evidence at this point. That's what I'm excited to start looking into by onboarding specifically the job postings that you're going to see popping up at the beginning of next year for positions like data scientist. So that's getting folks with the skill set to be able to make those sort of inferences. Most of our recommendations to this point have been based on leveraging what we know from our investigative outcomes, as well as looking at best practices nationally. Now it's going to be about taking specific data points and also bolstering our recommendations with respect to that, and then hopefully being able to see, where there's movement on some of these issues, or not, because that also is important information.
Great, thanks so much. And for my next question, so you mentioned that certain cases used to be investigated by the Bureau of Internal Affairs, Fourth Amendment cases, I think you mentioned. Did you see any change in case result patterns once that was taken on by you, either more or less resulting in discipline or harsher or less discipline?
I haven't looked specifically at BIA's recommendations versus COPA's in that space. So I can't answer that specifically. I can say that month after month, and CPD is well aware of this because I report out on it at the police board every month, Fourth Amendment or improper search or seizure are the single highest kind of complaints. It's not sustained complaints every month, but it is certainly the highest complaint that we receive every month, or type of complaint.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. And for my last question, what do you think are the largest factors that are barriers to your investigations moving faster? What barriers do you face in general?
I think there's a couple of different things. Number one, I think that it can't really be overstated. We have spent a lot of time making sure that we know how to get it right to the best of our ability from our perspective. That I have a supervisor that referred to it recently as that our investigations are almost like a handcrafted artisanal investigation, meaning that we're poring over this, our summary reports. If you look at what we publish in a summary report after we conclude an investigation versus almost any other civilian oversight entity, our analysis is much more lengthy and in-depth. I think we had to do that because we had a lot of trust to try to build because of what existed here before in Chicago. So that wasn't an accident that we spend the amount of time that we do making sure we get it right in the way that we're reporting. But we are now in a position where time and time again, our investigations have withstood scrutiny outside of our office. The perception, I should say, of our predecessor agencies was that we lacked the ability to do this, that the Independent Police Review Authority wasn't actually independent, didn't function with the kind of integrity that the city needed. Those aren't really the complaints that we're getting about COPA any longer, and that's because we are taking the amount of time to try to get it right. But we have to get it right on a timeline that is palatable for everyone. And so that is where the next years of my leadership, I hope to really focus.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chief Kersten. Good evening. Great to see you.
You too.
So 2 quick questions I have for you. One, can you give us a quick update on the status of your consent decree compliance? And if you are not in compliance, sort of share what is hindering that?
Sure. That's one of the things I like to talk about because we've been able to kind of really gain some good traction in our consent decree compliance. For those who are unaware, the way the independent monitoring team is evaluating compliance is a tiered approach. And so the first step is gaining preliminary compliance, which is really based on policy development. And of the paragraphs under the consent decree that apply to COPA, we are, by the end of the year, going to, I anticipate, be at either 98 or 100% preliminary compliance by the end of this calendar year, somewhere in that ballpark. And we've already managed to gain secondary compliance, which is largely based off of training and being able to demonstrate that we've taken a well-developed policy and now we're training our staff on it. We've already started to gain and have gained secondary compliance on, I want to say it's between 30%, somewhere around 30% of our consent decree paragraphs, maybe even as high as 40. I'm sure that's in my book, but I'm just going to be general tonight instead of being super specific. And then lastly, the third tier that the consent decree is being evaluated on by our monitoring team is operational compliance. So that's saying you got your policy, you're trained on your policy, and now you're actually doing it that way. And COPA has already started to gain operational compliance on around 20% or so of our paragraphs. So what I think is important are 2 things. Number one, the last training, consent decree training that we put forth as an agency was evaluated by members of the independent monitoring team, members of the Attorney General's office, and then also representation from the city's Department of Law were there. And the feedback that we received from that was overwhelmingly positive in the sense that not only are we checking the boxes and kind of, doing the things that are required, but we had subject matter experts internal to our agency, an investigator, a supervisor, that were delivering this content in a way that really demonstrated that we aren't just here to check boxes. We're here to change the way we do business and to make sure that that is in compliance with these principles that the consent decree is rooted in. We talk a lot intentionally in our agency about culture change. This is about culture change. And so being able to have staff deliver training to showcase the ways in which we're trying to approach that evolution and that culture change was a really rewarding opportunity. And really happy to be able to highlight that to this group tonight. The second thing that I think is exciting is the consent decree was always supposed to be complied with over time. It wasn't going to ever be flipping a switch and saying you've now complied. The original timeline set out for the city to come into compliance with the consent decree was 5 years. That has had to be extended for lots of reasons that are very valid, but COPA is still on pace to meet that original 5-year mark. And so we are hopeful that we will fulfill that requirement and be able to say that we are in compliance fully, operationally, within 5 years from when the consent decree went into place. And that's our mission right now, and we're really excited about it.
Thank you so much, Chief Kersten. And so my next question just piggybacks off of some of the things that you've said and also the questions that have been asked as it relates to the goals in complying with completing cases in a more timely manner. This is budget season, so are you, is the current budget, the proposed budget that you all are being offered and the things that you're looking to do, is it sufficient enough in order for you all to reach those goals within the upcoming budget year?
Those are the goals. The things I've asked for are the things that we need right now operationally as an agency. And a lot of emphasis gets placed on our investigative staff and whether that is scaled appropriately to the weight of what we have as far as caseload is concerned. I think it's hard at this point to evaluate whether we need greater resource allocation in the investigative ranks, largely because for our entire 5-year history, we have run with vacancies in our investigative unit. So a big focus of my work is about hiring, recruitment, and retention of these positions. That's a challenge across government. That's not a COPA-specific challenge. That's not a CPD-specific challenge. That's the work of being in civil service and in government work in an evolving job market. So we're excited about that challenge, but that is, I hope in this next year to stabilize our attrition levels to the point that I can better answer that question and go back to City Council and say, now that I know what I know based on having a consistent level of staffing and investigations for this last year, using our data, as I keep referencing, to do staffing allocation studies, that's when I hope to be able to make that kind of request if it's warranted. But I see my role first and foremost as being a good steward of the resources that we do have and knowing that we have work to do with filling our remaining vacancies. That is what my focus is going to be in 2023.
Good evening, Chief Kersten.
Good evening.
First, I just want to commend you for the goal of increasing your staff to include data scientists or analysts that will collect and analyze trends in police misconduct. I think that will be very useful information for us as we do our work to inform what policies need to be changed and where things are improving or not. So thank you for that. I haven't visited this magical website that my fellow commissioners have mentioned, so I apologize if this information is readily available. I am curious from your predecessor organization, IPRA, one of its reasons I think it was so ineffective is because and it's been some years, but I remember the data was appalling. It was huge numbers of complaints filed, but because of numerous administrative hurdles, sworn complaints, et cetera, there was a very small number that actually made it to a full investigation. And then out of that full investigation, there's an even smaller number that was founded or sustained. I can't remember what the language was. And then out of that, it was an even smaller number that the Chicago Police Department then agreed with the outcome. And it basically made the investigative process, I would say, almost really completely ineffective, that there was really no consequences through that process. I'm just curious if you have the data tonight to show how many total complaints, how many investigations completed, what were how many just high level numbers, sustained or not, whatever language you use, and if you could break that down for us.
I will say generally that trend isn't completely changed from where we are today. And there's a couple things I want to talk about with respect to that. So we take in around 4,000 complaints every year. As I said, we're the receptacle of all citizen-based complaints against the Chicago Police Department and its members. Through those 4,000 complaints, we have to sift through them and figure out what belongs to BIA under their jurisdiction, what stays at COPA, what isn't actually a complaint against CPD or needs to be referred out to another agency. Within the cases that we retain at COPA every year, which is around somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500, something like that, stay at COPA. The vast majority do end up at BIA, and then a small fraction go to other places. We always, year after year, still, as COPA, still close more cases without serving allegations and bringing an officer in to answer to those allegations. And historically, that's always been looked at as this means it's failing and things aren't working. But I want to say the number one thing that we have in our possession now, the most relevant piece of information that we're using to evaluate a lot of those cases is body-worn camera evidence. So we now have in most of these cases, the vast majority of them, sort of that immutable evidence where you can take a look at what came in as a Fourth Amendment complaint saying, I was stopped for no reason, or I believe the reason I was stopped in my vehicle was because of the color of my skin. And while that may be a very valid experience that was felt by the person that made the complaint, if there's body-worn camera evidence that shows there was probable cause for the stop, that means it's not going to result in a misconduct allegation. So the numbers are still stark in that regard. But here's what I think is important. We've always historically kind of said, well, okay, if those allegations aren't founded or don't end up sustained, then it doesn't mean anything. But I think it's quite the opposite. The fact that we have as many allegations as we have, particularly about Fourth Amendment issues, and particularly in some of the same districts, the same neighborhoods, the same blocks sometimes, means something. That means there's a breakdown in trust that has to be addressed. Whether or not that complaint ended up in actionable misconduct isn't and shouldn't be the end of the story. That's not a win for the department, and it's certainly not a win for the public that they serve. So what I think we're going to need to do differently, and what this is why our reliance on data and evidence-based solutions for this, is start unpacking what those complaint rates mean. Why is it that there are certain areas in the city that we get the same complaints over and over again? And you may be able to find technical reasons why those actions were technically okay from a policing standpoint, but obviously they are speaking to a broader systemic issue in the way in which CPD and the communities they serve are interacting. And that's where I think some of the real work of reform is going to bear the most fruit. So I can tell you the numbers still are what they're improved. Our sustained case rate is much more in line with the national average now than it was under IPRA. But that doesn't mean that every complaint that comes in ends up in sustained misconduct allegations. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean the system's not working. We just have to think differently about what those allegations represent and how we avoid so many 4,000 members of our community feeling the need to make these complaints year after year. That's where that trust component has to be improved. And I'm excited to start looking at that from a data-driven perspective.
Thank you. I look forward to those reports as well. Commissioner Driver has a question that I think you'd like me to ask. That I'm not gonna use it as, I have another question that I'm not gonna burn. I'm not asking your question. I'm kidding. But what was the question? It was, what's the difference between COPA and BIA? If you could explain that, for some people, not everybody understands what COPA does and what BIA does.
Thank you. This is a very acronym-intensive area of work, and I sometimes speak only in those acronyms, so I apologize. So BIA is the Bureau of Internal Affairs at the Chicago Police Department. Virtually every law enforcement agency has its own internal review mechanism, and BIA is that for our Chicago Police Department. And they also investigate allegations of misconduct, but their jurisdiction is separate and apart from ours. So they wouldn't investigate an excessive force claim or an officer-involved shooting at an administrative level at all. Those things, the Fourth Amendment allegations, those fall within COPA's purview.
Thank you. My last question is less of a question, or maybe it is a question, I guess. It is just, I'm wondering if there's a possibility for partnership here. You had mentioned that you guys have jurisdiction over Fourth Amendment violations, And, you know, as a defense lawyer, who's, you know, of course, filed many motions in court to suppress evidence for violations of Fourth Amendment rights, is there a pathway or a process where when a judge determines that that right has been violated and evidence is therefore then suppressed, is there a way of you all being somehow notified and that trigger an investigation itself? Or does the complaint still need to be filed? Or is it at least data that we could include in the summary total of your findings around Fourth Amendment? Because I do think it's at least relevant that, you know, a sitting court judge in Cook County suppressed evidence based upon a finding that the right was violated.
Absolutely, and I think we've really tried to create inroads specifically with folks like the Public Defender's Office, Plaintiff's Bar for federal civil rights litigation, et cetera, and need to continue to create those inroads. We can investigate any case that is brought to our attention, but what we don't know, often, obviously, we can't investigate. We are able to, you know, receive copies of transcripts and things like that. We often incorporate, and it's even in our ordinance that we must incorporate transcripts and findings specifically from whether it's parallel criminal or civil litigation. So that's routinely part of the body of evidence that we are using in our investigations. But yes, I think there could be opportunities for greater partnership. We've done sort of what we can in some of those spaces, but getting you know, a collective of voices that do criminal defense work. We also have a strong relationship with the state's attorney's office, but they are on different sides of the Fourth Amendment issue quite frequently from us. So yes, we can do more in that space, but there is already some partnership. I will note, and this doesn't apply necessarily to a judicial finding, but we often have cases where we'll get a complaint from someone who is now facing criminal liability, and up to litigation in their criminal case, it's very difficult, and we can almost never secure an interview or their version of events based on the interconnected nature of the administrative allegation against the police officer and their potential criminal liability. So we work really hard with defense attorneys to try to create an environment in which they would make their clients available for those kinds of interviews when possible, or they would follow up with their client that once the criminal case is resolved one way or another, to then be willing to work with us and give us their version of events. Because not everything is captured on body-worn camera. Not everything can be investigated without that individual's version of events. So there's much more work to be done in that space, and I would appreciate any and all partnership in creating those inroads.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here, Chief Kersten. I have a question, but before that, I would like to make a statement so that we can put a little bit of context behind my question. And if you disagree with where I'm trying to place this context, that's totally okay. I'm also learning a lot as I'm going. The Bureau of Internal Affairs, BIA, COPA, the Office of the Inspector General, to a large extent, these oversight bodies all do oversight in an internal way, right? It's the city's mechanism for, you know, trying to avoid police misconduct or holding police officers that do engage in misconduct accountable. That's not the only mechanism. Of course, we have, you know, the civil courts that sometimes, and on specific, very egregious occasions, criminal courts that do that. That's an exterior mechanism that has oversight over our city and over our, you know, our officers. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that's a fair statement.
I'm curious to know, for incidents where you all receive a complaint and it's not sustained, or you know, decide that you don't have enough, not sustained, there's no finding, sorry, let me speak in contextual terms. There's no finding, you know, you don't think there's enough evidence there to really have any recommendation. Do you ever get information on how this moves on that parallel line, on the court's process? Because I think something that I'm curious to know when you're talking about partnerships, and Commissioner Nels' question brought me to this, do you ever get information about potential like civil settlements or civil lawsuits or criminal settlements and criminal lawsuits that might have been investigations that would have been reported or were not reported to your agency? Is that question clear? I think I'm trying to connect the interior and the exterior oversight mechanisms, and I'm trying to see if there's any synergy on this. I know that the Inspector General does post facto investigations on the investigations that have findings. But I'm curious to know what happens to the investigations that are, get results in the courts and, might or might not come back to us.
So there's a couple different sort of junction points at which we find out. Let's start with civil litigation. First of all, you very articulately put out that yes, there are many paths by which these kinds of incidents can be litigated and brought to conclusion. So with civil litigation, when a case is filed against a member of the Chicago Police Department, a lawsuit specifically, the Department of Law for the city is obligated to notify us and CPD, COPA and CPD about that so that we can open our investigation into that incident. So at the very beginning, and
just to clarify, so when a civil litigation happens, you are notified by the Department of Law
yes,
about that?
And sometimes, and this came up this was on full display, this system not working the way it's supposed to in the Anjanette Young case, where a lawsuit was filed and for months COPA wasn't notified about it. So we've worked with the Department of Law as well as CPD to create better processes by which we make sure that that influx of information is steady and it's happening like multiple times a month, so that we get notification, and does the department, about any civil suit that's filed against a department member. And then it's for COPA to determine whether that is in our jurisdiction or something that we need to open an investigation on. The other junction point that occurs in civil litigation is before any settlement can be paid out to any litigants by the city, it has to go for a vote before City Council. And City Council, COPA is always involved in the preparation for those votes, meaning we're given a list of all the cases that are being settled, and we're getting an opportunity to cross-reference that with our own data and make sure we have an investigation if it falls under our jurisdiction. And we have to come to these conversations prepared to explain what our position is on any given investigation. So that's another junction point. And then lastly, I will say that there are times, as I was mentioning in some of my other answers, where we close a case, sometimes because we don't have a litigant's side of the equation. Not everything, as I mentioned before, can be resolved just on body-worn camera alone. So there are times where cases are closed, where we know there's pending litigation. And then if there's a settlement that's reached, we're able to reevaluate that. And the city also gives us notification at the back end. So there's times where we have reopened an investigation based on a deposition being given that we can now incorporate in our analysis. So that's how it works in civil court. In criminal court, we have a very robust working relationship with the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, the Federal Bureau of Investigations, and the Department of Justice. So under the consent decree, we are mandated to refer any complaints of misconduct that meets criminal statute elements to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office for their review. So we are in constant communication with them if we get an excessive force case in that rises to that level or anything of that nature. And then also, and so we're sending them the information on that case for them to then make a determination as to whether there needs to be any criminal action filed. In addition, I mentioned before, we conduct investigations on an administrative level into all officer-involved shootings and all officer-involved deaths. Every single one of those we are briefing the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, the FBI, and the Department of Justice on. Not to say that we think all of these need to be criminally prosecuted at all, but instead to share with them consistently each use of deadly force that's happening in our city for them to evaluate whether criminal charges would be appropriate. So that's an ongoing part and function of the work that we do. I think that answers that.
No, thank you for your response. And sorry that I think this can be a little complicated for people that are not super familiar with the oversight system, and the fact that it's not only occurring internally, but also in conjunction with the courts can be complicated. One last question, and you don't have to answer this like right now, because I know this has gone a little bit over what the allotted time was. When the Department of Law provides information on the settlements, does it provide the individual case? Does it provide any information on like aggregate data that they've gathered from like the cases? I assume when you present yourself with your set of recommendations, or not recommendations, sorry, with the cases that you've reviewed in front of City Council, you have some aggregate data and you're getting better at it, as it seems. Does the law department provide anything like that for you to assess maybe patterns on what's leading to these settlements? Maybe holes in possible civil litigation investigation, or anything like that that can help inform how you open or choose not to open investigations?
So the processes I've described are really dealing with individual cases. They're not set up to look at the aggregate, this came up in my budget hearing before City Council, specifically to sort of risk management practices by the Department of Law, the city, and trying to avoid the number of settlements and the amount of settlements that we have to pay out every year for these cases. But COPA has not had a very large voice in looking at it that way from sort of a pattern and practice perspective. Again, I am excited to have the opportunity to bring on board the resources with which to start looking at things that way. I think in order for us to move forward in this issue, we absolutely have to be looking at what the data shows about what trends are existing. So each one of these notifications that we're receiving is about an individual case. And there is not yet, to my knowledge, at least not that COPA is participating in, a broader system that's looking at it more sort of pattern and practice wise.
Thank you so much. That's my last question. One quick comment for people that want to read complicated reports that deal with this thing. The Office of the Inspector General also made an evaluation into the legal department's data gathering process. I don't have my notes in front of me, but they had some fairly concerning findings and made some recommendations as well that we'll definitely continue to consider.
Hi, good evening.
Hi.
I don't know. Yeah, there we go. So I have a couple questions, mostly related to your goal of consistency and efficiency. Do you have a protocol in place for how you prioritize your investigations, or you do them chronologically?
I wouldn't say they're chronologically. We recognize, just full stop, that we can't close everything on the timeline that we would like to. So we've spent the last 2 years really trying to identify cases of particularly high public interest. Some high profile examples of that would be the incident with Miss Nikita Brown on North Avenue Beach. We understood that involved one officer. It was one incident. We closed that within 60 days because the public demanded answers on that case. Another example would be some of the higher profile shootings that have happened. While historically a lot of shootings have taken years to investigate, we've managed to close some in as few as 6 months, 9 months, 13 months, which may still sound like a long time, but you have to remember sort of where we're coming from. So we've really taken strides to try to close the cases that we know we need answers to as a city as quickly and effectively as we can. Early in my tenure as chief, I met with Superintendent Brown and his leadership team, and one of the things that he specifically asked about was whether COPA would have the ability to sort of create a unit within investigations that would be able to respond quicker to some of those cases that needed those immediate answers. He said it was something he was exploring with BIA as well. And I can say that this unit that I've been talking about with operational efficiencies, we're hoping to get staffed up a component that will actually be able to do just that within that same unit for later in the spring of 2023. So sort of having the ability, this came up with Anjanette Young, that was a case that sat for far too long at our agency, and then being able to pivot quickly and pull together a team of people to get answers delivered on as fast of a timeline as we could was something that we had to marshal a lot of resources to be able to do. Having a team in place that doesn't carry a large caseload and can be more responsive as those kinds of cases pop up is something that we are putting in place for this next year. So that's our short-term solution, but the long-term solution is what I've been saying all evening too. We just simply have to be more operationally effective, and we have a pathway towards achieving that.
Okay. And then you indicated that, like all other agencies, you are suffering from vacancies and attrition. How many vacancies do you currently have?
It's currently, I want to say 23-ish, 24, somewhere around there. Out of our total headcount for 2023 budgeted will be 154. So we still have a significant chunk of vacancies. What I would say the good news with respect to that is, I'm sorry, there's weird feedback happening, is that our approach to filling the vacancies has really been about solidifying leadership. We, at the beginning of this last year, 2022, saw a big attrition at our supervising investigator level. For those that are familiar with policing, I would say that's kind of akin to like a sergeant, your frontline supervisors. And so we knew immediately it was of urgent concern that we solidify that job title within our agency. We were able to promote 3 different individuals internally into those roles and hire an external person with a lot of expertise and sort of solidify that. And then that led to a cascade of other internal promotions. I think we had about 22 internal promotions this year as an agency, which makes me tremendously happy for for two reasons. Number one, that's our staff saying, we understand this mission, we know it's difficult, and we are signing up to be part of the solution. And so that to me is tremendously encouraging about sort of the organizational health for us as an agency. And then it also led to this situation where now most of our vacancies are at those frontline positions. So when I'm recruiting and you know, promoting our COPA Academy, it's to hire on the new crop of people that are going to hopefully succeed and have those professional development opportunities within the agency. And that to me is an easier vacancy to fill than a lot of those managerial and leadership roles. So I think that the outlook is bright, but we still have work to do.
Okay. With respect to your recommendations for discipline, do you guys work off a matrix? How do you make those recommendations?
So there was a matrix that was in place briefly several years ago, and then it was litigated in labor claim basically by the union saying that this matrix had been developed without being bargained for. So there was a judicial ruling or an arbitration award actually that indicated we could not use the matrix, and CPD also can't use the matrix. So the city and the unions need to come back to the table and sort of assess what a matrix could or should look like in order to move forward with something that we would be legally able to use. I can say in response to that, we've done two different things. Number one, we have created a position internal to the agency that's going to be removed from investigations to sort of help apply consistency and put parameters around making sure we're tracking all of those recommendations so that officer over here and officer over here with similar outcomes have similar recommendations, right? Wanting to make sure that we can ensure that consistency. So we're tasking sort of an analyst position with looking at that work. But secondly, we've also taken a page from the Inspector General's book and started giving the department bigger ranges of potential discipline with which for them to decide, which I ultimately think is quite appropriate for the employer themselves to decide what is the specific amount of discipline that's appropriate. So you'll see big ranges of discipline, and particularly a lot of our most severe cases saying it needs to be a minimum of 180-day suspension up to and including separation. Department, it is your responsibility to figure out exactly what that looks like. And within those ranges, the department often agrees somewhere in that possibility is the right answer, and sometimes they go with separation, sometimes it's in the middle. So we do our best without a matrix, but it is one of the things that I think the city should definitely consider putting time into developing. I think it's a fundamental issue of due process, and we'd be happy to be a part of whatever conversation COPA is needed to be in around that issue.
So today, if you were making a recommendation, right, and you were going to provide that range, whose decision would it be as to what that range is going to look like?
Right now, the way that it works, because the position I was talking about doesn't exist yet, but it'll be for 2023, it goes up through our investigative chain. So something else that's important for the public and the police department to understand is no one single investigator decides any outcome in the case. These are team-based decisions. So there's an investigator, there's a supervising investigator, there's a deputy chief, and then there's also the legal department that are all weighing in on these cases. Cases of the most severe outcomes also need my input as well. So depending on the severity of the case, the recommendation might come directly from the deputy chief. But if it's a more severe case, I'm also going to be involved. But none of those decisions are made by one person. They're always made with the input of the entire team and with, to the best of our ability, sort of a global view of what we've done in other instances. It's not to say we always get it right and consistent. That's why there's room for improvement. But that's how we try to approach those recommendations.
Okay, and so I just want to make sure that I'm clear on this process. So you indicated that there's majority of the time you and the COPA and the superintendent reach an agreement, right? And then there's some cases where you don't, and then sometimes you work it out after discussion, and then sometimes they get referred to the police board.
Yes.
Do you have a stat on how often the police board affirms your decision?
In this last year, it was somewhere around 60 or 70% of the time. It
Okay.
changes year to year. I don't know of a year since I've been at COPA that it's been less than 50% of the time that the police board has agreed with us. But it's certainly not that they are in lockstep with us either. They don't serve as a rubber stamp for our recommendations. I think their members try to meaningfully evaluate each and every case individually. And certainly you see high profile examples even in the last months of the police board member disagreeing with COPA and affirming the superintendent's recommendation.
Okay, last question. This one is, I'm gonna just give a small explanation so it makes sense to everybody. So I'm curious as to whether this is COPA's responsibility or if there's a responsibility for it either in the police board or in CPD. But as former prosecutors, right, if there's been an issue with respect to administrative discipline that would implicate Giglio. And Giglio is a case that says that if police officers do something that would go to their bias or credibility or their ability to testify in court, that information has to be disclosed to the prosecution so they can disclose it to the defense so everybody knows that there's a problem potentially out there with this officer in basic terms. So who's responsible for Giglio reporting? Is that COPA or is that somebody else?
I think COPA is responsible for Giglio reporting when it's one of our investigations that's
Okay.
implicated. And so we have routinely received requests from both the U.S. Attorney's Office as well as the State's Attorney's Office for cases that they have pending to make sure they're doing it preemptively often. And then there's a unit within the State's Attorney's Office, the Law Enforcement and Accountability Division. That group, because we are in constant dialogue with them, we are telling them about cases about officers' truthfulness and things of that nature. They tend to be more interested in sustained findings than allegations. So it's an evolving process, I would say, about when that notification is made. But yes, those are conversations that are ongoing because of the relationship that we have with that particular unit. And then, as I said, the U.S. Attorney's Office is always asking us. So.
Okay, got it. Thank you. You've been on the hot seat for a long time, so we appreciate all the info.
One more?
Like two more.
Okay.
Then we'll close the meeting. So I really appreciate the hyper focus on being data driven. That's something that I'm very passionate about myself. But I think a lot of times we can sort of get out of touch with the practical reality that people face on the ground and get really caught up in numbers. And as I was sitting here listening to you, it just made me wonder. You mentioned the Laquan McDonald case, which the vast majority of Chicagoans are familiar with. If that happened today, what would be different? Or will anything be different? Like what type of safeguards or like what is different in this iteration if that case were to come before COPA today that wouldn't result in the same thing that happened where you have a person egregiously murdered and then you have a few officers, a bunch of officers who essentially lie about what happened. So if something like that was to happen today, is there anything in place that would ensure a different result?
I think the single biggest thing that would ensure a different result that we have in place is COPA's transparency obligations. A big part of what took place in that case was the 13 or 14 months, so over a year delay in the public seeing what was plain to the public that wasn't plain to the department at the time or the Cook County State's Attorney's Office at the time. So we're under an obligation to publish videos like that within 60 days of an incident. So I think that allows for that level playing field where all of the stakeholders, government and community, have access to the same information. So that's the single biggest thing that I think changes the trajectory of a case like that exists now that didn't exist then. The second thing that I'll talk about is you mentioned officers that were involved in that case, maybe in the aftermath, signing off on reports, I think you're probably getting at, or co-signing essentially on a version of events that didn't really square with what actually took place. Something I can say about the way COPA has approached its work is talked a lot tonight about our jurisdiction, and we get a complaint in for excessive force, and we could just say, all right, we are tasked with looking at excessive force, and so we're going to look at that use of force, and that's the end of the story. But instead, we have a demonstrated track record of saying, we're going to look at the use of force, but we're also going to look at the reports that were generated around that use of force, the supervisors that signed off on those reports and hold those individuals at times just as accountable if those reports are authored in a way that misstates or omits important pieces of information that make the report untrue. And so that is the majority of the difference, I would say, with sort of how we approach these cases. That really is a difference than what you saw before. And we have lots of examples of us trying to make sure that report writing is as accurate as possible. I go every time a new recruit class is coming in, I personally go to talk to them, and report writing is one of the things I really hammer to them, that's one of the most important things that you can do as an officer is write a report. Even if it's unflattering, it needs to be accurate. And so making sure that there's accountability, not just for the officers involved in an incident that we have a complaint about, but also the supervisors that knew about it or should have known about it or wrote about it in ways that were not accurate.
Thank you. And you mentioned just recently that your office wasn't aware of the civil suit filed by Ms. Angela Young?
Not initially, no. We weren't notified about that by the Department of Law at first.
Are there any safeguards in place now to ensure that that wouldn't happen again? And not like, are there any safeguards in place that are like binding that have to be followed?
I don't know about binding. I can just say that we've had multiple meetings and worked to develop, MOUs or memorandums of understanding between COPA, CPD, and the Department of Law to try to sort of mandate that practice. We need to talk specifically to the Department of Law about who's generating that list and how that list is being generated. But I can tell you I am personally CC'd on the emails that come in usually twice a month, I believe, is the cadence of them, showing everything that has been filed up until that point. I want to exist in a world where emails isn't how we're doing all of that. And so using our case management system and getting DOL kind of locked into that and having a different ability to communicate with each other to make things more automated is something that we're always striving for. But I will say there has been a significant and more methodical approach to it by DOL.
Would you say that that's mostly, is there something in writing, or is it mostly based on like trust between?
I actually don't remember if we ended up executing the MOU or not. I can get back to you with that and talk to my general counsel about it. But I know that was definitely part of the discussion around this particular issue. And if it hasn't been executed, that's something that we need to revive as a conversation with them.
Thank you. And one comment and one question, and I'll be done. The comment is that it's, and I know I'm not putting this on either department or agency, but as a civilian, when something happens, one of the things that definitely frustrates me a lot is that like it's literally like stacked on top of each other sometimes. And I know that your agency is independent from the police department, but it's like as a civilian, a shooting happens, an officer-involved shooting happens, and it's like Tom Ahern tweets a picture of a gun, and then underneath that tweet is like COPA putting out a statement, and then the public is generally left trying to figure out which agency is correct here and like what's happening, and it's all very confusing from just an everyday citizen point of view. And the last question that I have is regarding anonymous complaints. So in a city where you have this terrible history of policing, where you have the legacy of John Burge, where you have the legacy of Laquan McDonald, where we were, that our county was the torture capital. If I, as a citizen, wanted to file an anonymous complaint about an officer or misconduct, can you talk a little bit about any safeguards that are in place to ensure that the everyday citizen will not be retaliated against and their information will remain confidential?
Well, previously there was more of an outright prohibition against investigating anonymous complaints, but two things have changed. There's been legislative change in Springfield that has led to statewide reforms in that area. And then also the labor contracts that our officers operate under, some of the renegotiated most recent contracts also have expanded our ability to do things like investigate without an affidavit and investigate anonymous complaints in certain instances. So we have greater ability to do that. What I always say to everyone is file your complaint. And if we can find a way, whether you want to, and even on our website, it gives you options for filing complaints anonymously. So if you're not comfortable giving your identity, give us the information and we will take it and do as much with it as we are permitted to do under the contract and the existing law around that issue. So our website makes that option clear to people. We try to talk about that publicly to people as well. And then I'll just say, lastly, we have thousands of people that, despite what you just described, are still willing to sign up and tell us their story. And I think that's incredibly courageous. And so I'm heartened by the fact that we have Chicagoans doing that every day in these incredibly difficult circumstances. And they trust us with their stories. So.
Thank you. Before I close, any other questions from commissioners? I think Cliff has a joke he wants to tell everybody. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you, Chief Administrator Kersten. The next order of business is the announcement of the next commission meeting. The commission's next regular meeting will be on November 14th at 6:30 p.m. We will announce the location in the coming days of that meeting. We hope to see everybody on the 14th at that meeting, and we hope you'll stay engaged and encourage people to help join us in this work. The last thing, I want to plug the district council races. Right now, the ordinance created the ordinance that gives the commission authority created two different bodies. One is the district councils, and the other is the 7-person commission that you see here today. The district councils are vitally important. They will be 66 new folks who are elected officials and 3 people per police district. So that's 22 police districts, 3 folks elected to each to create a body that is hyper-local, that is accountable to residents to actually provide a voice in public safety. So I want to plug that. Folks are out petitioning now. If you yourself want to run, you can visit the State Board of Elections website to run. I would encourage you to support a candidate. I would encourage you to run yourself. I would encourage you to find out who's running in your community and figure out how you can get involved with that. With that, there being no further business before the commission, is there a motion to adjourn? Motion by Commissioner Troncoso. Do I hear a second?
Second.
All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any nays? The meeting of the Community Commission for Public Safety and Accountability is officially adjourned.
And one last thing, sorry, if you have comments about our meetings and how they're going well or not, you want to hear, just want to hear that.